Now we're going to go ahead and create the environment. To get started with this, we're going to use ProBuilder to create our terrain. We're going to create the terrain in a way that would be beneficial for optimization. So what we're going to do is we're going to first load in ProBuilder. To do this, we'll go to Window, Package Manager, and then go to All, and then you're going to select ProBuilder, and then you should have Install. Once it's installed, it will then appear in the In Project tab. Once that is in, you can go to the Tools menu bar, and you'll see ProBuilder. Go ahead and open the ProBuilder window, and let's dock that next to the inspector. Now let's go ahead and create a new shape. Let's create a plane, and we're going to set up the width and height to 10 by 10, and then on the width and length segments, we're also going to do 10 by 10. Now what we'll do is simply hit Build Plane to finalize the creation of that, and then we're going to close down our Shape tool. Then what we're going to do is we're going to set the position of this to be 0, 0, and 0. Okay. Now let's duplicate this object by hitting Control D, and then now let's snap the object to the edge here. So we're going to hold down Control, and we're going to drag this out to here. You also have the ability to show off vertex snapping. If we select both of these game objects, then we hit Control D to duplicate and move them out, and you'll notice the separation here. Hold down V, select the corner, left click and hold, and then drag to the next vertex that you want it to snap to. Then what we'll do is we'll take this, and we're going to hit Control D to duplicate, and we're going to snap it to the edges here, and then we're going to select the rest of these, Control D one more time, and set those up here. So we should have a 4x4 grid. Now, with all of those set up here, there's one thing that I want to set up before we get going. Let's go to Window, Lighting, and Settings. In the lighting settings, if we drag these over here, you'll see there's this auto generate. Let's go ahead and turn that off so that way we're not continuing to generate light maps as we're working. Now that we have all of these set up, what we now want to do is use Polybrush to sculpt our terrain. So to get Polybrush, we're going to go to Asset Store, and you're going to search for Polybrush. Once you find it, you should download it and then import it. And once it's imported, you'll find it under Tools and then Polybrush. Let's go ahead and open up the Polybrush window, and we're going to drag and drop that right next to ProBuilder. Now what this allows us to do is it allows us to sculpt on these individual objects that we have selected. Now because I have all of these grids set up and I want to be able to sculpt on them all at the same time, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the general settings here, and I want to turn off this lock brush to first. And what this does is that whenever it's turned on, it prevents the mesh from intercepting a stroke. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And then now, if I go to my push and pull vertex tool, I can left click and hold, and it will allow me to begin painting on the rest of these. Now you'll notice that it's not painting on the others because they aren't selected. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this plane and all of these, and then I'm going to go to, let's go to ProBuilder, and then as we start to sculpt across this, you'll see that we're now sculpting on all of these. Now, the last thing that we see here is that it is creating some holes in between the seams, and I really don't want that. And the reason that that's happening is because of the orientation of our brush. So I'm going to go to Polybrush, and I'm going to set the direction here to up, and then I'm also going to say ignore open edges. So what's going to happen now is that whenever I start working on this, you'll see that it's ignoring those edges and keeping them together. So now what I can do is I can come in and I can just start to kind of rough up the overall terrain. My suggestion would be to do something kind of random to where it's just making a little bit of variation in the ground all throughout this. I wouldn't suggest doing anything that is really out there to where you have a really high hill or something like that. That can cause some problems with running around, but give your participants the room that they need. Okay, so I'll create something like this. And I'm just kind of working that around. I just want to make sure that the areas aren't flat. Okay. So now that we have that, kind of take a look around. And this feels pretty good. I'm happy with that. Now, there is one other thing that you could do. Let's say that perhaps some of these areas need to be lowered or maybe smoothed out a little bit. You could use the Smooth Vertex Positions tool here and begin to smooth out some of these hills. Now, if we wanted to dig down into one of these, we'll need to go back to Push and Pull, and you'll hold down Control. And let's go ahead and use this one right here. Let's hold down Control, and we can create this little pit. And I'm really going to kind of push this down a little bit here. I'm going to use this as like maybe my acid pit that I have in mind for my level. Okay, so I'm going to kind of push that down. Something like that. And make it deep enough to where the player could fall down into that. Now that we are going to have a mesh that will cover that up and make it look like acid on top of it, so an actual liquid. And that looks pretty good. You could also come in and do a little bit of smoothing on that. So let's say that it's not looking quite the way that you want to. You could smooth that out. Now that we have this set up, a couple of other things that you might notice about the objects themselves is that they look to be really hard. So if we kind of click away from that, you'll see that there's all of these little edges and facets. What we need to do now is actually smooth out the smoothing groups of the object. So what we're going to do is we're going to select plane, hold down Shift and select plane 15. So that will select everything in between. And we're going to go to face mode. Now with face mode active, I can left click and drag around that, and that will select all of the faces on that object. Let's go back to the Pro Builder tab. And on the Pro Builder tab, you're going to see smoothing. This brings up our smoothing group editor. Smoothing group editor, what it allows you to do is set the faces to a single smoothing group to make it appear as though it's been smoothed out. So I'm going to go through all of these and set their smoothing groups to 1. Now the number doesn't actually matter. What matters is that the faces that you have selected, if they are on the same smoothing group, so in this case, if all of the faces that we have selected are on smoothing group 1, it will appear as though they're all one continuous piece with no faceting. Now, as we go through this, you'll notice that it's going to look smoother and smoother on the different assets. So now that we have all of them, let's take a look at our scene, and you'll see that it does appear to be smoothed out. Now, the last thing that we'll see is that some of the UVs aren't exactly right. You'll see that some of the grids are actually kind of broken, and it doesn't quite look right. And our material won't look right either. So what we need to do is actually UV these meshes, and it's actually very easy to do. So let's select all of the assets again. So plane to plane 15. And then I'm going to select all of those faces again. And then I'm going to go to UV Editor. Under the UV Editor, if I zoom out, you'll notice that there's all of these UVs that have kind of been broken apart and really don't look that great. We're going to keep the mode set to auto, and then we're going to scroll down. And what we're going to do is we're going to say Group Selected Faces. That's going to rejoin them back into this position here. And if we look at the texture again, you'll see that it's all continuous and it looks good again. So now let's close that down, and there we go. So now we have our terrain set up. Now again, I want to stress that the reason that we have our terrain set up this way is that way if we need to optimize our game, we can use occlusion culling to get rid of the different planes that aren't being rendered by the camera. And so only a couple of these will show up at a time based on the camera's position and what it's looking at. So now what we'll need to do is set up the material for our terrain. So the material that we're going to be using, we're just going to learn how to assign the material. So to assign materials, it's really easy. It's just done by dragging and dropping. So let's go to the Assets folder, 3D Game Kit, and then we'll go to Art, Materials, and then Environment. The final folder is going to be Ground, and you'll see that we have this default ground. Drag and drop that onto each one of your tiles, and you'll notice that we have something that looks kind of like a mossy, muddy, rocky ground. So now that we have all of those assigned, you can see the reason that we would want the UVs all to be together, because it's using what's called a seamless texture. And so it looks like it's all one continuous ground piece all throughout this. So that looks really good. You also have the ability to go to your inspector with your ground material selected, and you can modify some of the different parameters here. So here we have our parallax, which kind of gives us a little bit more depth. We also have this water hardness edge, which will kind of modify the puddles a little bit. But what really modifies those puddles is this blend right here between the moss and the mud. So if you want it to be more mossy, you'll want to set it to something like 0. If we want it to have a little bit more mud, you'll go to 1. Okay. And then you also have the ability to adjust how wet this is. So you can see here that that moss is looking really, really wet. I'm actually going to drive that down a little bit. I don't want it to be too far out there. All right, so now that we have that material all set up, let's go ahead and move on to creating the boundary for our level. So the boundary is going to be done using what's called the ProBuilder New Poly Shape. Okay, so let's click on Poly Shape, and what this allows us to do is actually click different points in the 3D scene to create a very custom shape. So I'm going to go ahead and start off, and I'm going to click a few points here and there, and I'm just setting up kind of the boundary that my rocks and cliffs are going to make around my scene. So allow your participants to create whatever shape they desire, and then you'll also notice that you get a height. Once you have the desired height, you'll left click to finalize the creation of that. Now, one thing that you might notice is with our terrain, because it has these hills, it might offset the rotation a little bit, but that's nothing to worry about. What you can do is go to your inspector, and you can adjust the rotation here. So I'm going to actually, let's set that back to 90 there. So that way we're back in place here. And then we're going to go to edge mode. Actually, you know what? With this still selected, we can actually move these vertices around. But if those vertices don't show up, let's say that we've accidentally clicked away from it. Select this object, and let's go ahead and go to edge mode. And you can select the individual edges, and you can move those around. Okay, and modify your shape a little bit more. Now, I know that I really don't want to waste too much of my terrain, but I want to create a shape that is interesting. So I'll do something that looks kind of like this. So this is basically going to be the boundary for my rocks. If I need to go a little bit higher on this, I'm going to go ahead and grab face mode, select that top face, and I'm going to drag that up a little bit or down, depending on what your need is. So now that we have the boundary set up, let's actually invert it so that way it looks like we have polygons on the inside, because this is actually going to be our play space. So what we'll do is we'll select all of the faces on this object. Now, in order for this to work, we need to go to the ProBuilder window, and let's make sure that Select Hidden is turned on. By default, it might say off. If you try to select the faces, all of them, by left-clicking and dragging around them, what it will do is it will not allow you to select the ones that were not in view of the camera. So let's turn that on, and if we select around it, it will select everything. Now, with all of these faces selected, we're going to go to Flip Normals. And what that does is it flips the face of the polygon that is being rendered, in this case, the normal, to be on the inside. So now all we have to do is select this bottom face, and let's choose Delete Faces. And then we're going to select the top and do the same thing. So now we're left with our terrain, and we have this neat little boundary here. And this is just going to be a guide for us in our level. It's really important to stress at this point that ProBuilder is great for prototyping, and it could also be used to create very simple assets and model them right inside of Unity. So now that we have that built, now what we would want to do is begin the process of replacing what we've blocked out with our final assets. So in this case, what we would do is go to the 3D Game Kit folder, Art, Environment, and then you'll see that we have Rock. In the Rock, let's make sure we're not in Materials. Models, there we go. So Models, Environment, Rock, and we have like these big cliffs. Typically what I like to do is just drag and drop the ones that I know that I will probably use, and I'll just drag one of each in, and then I'll duplicate them as needed. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and grab my Move tool, and I'm going to pull that in, and I'm going to start to kind of rotate them. And it's something that you'll want to show off to your participants, that they can actually cause models to overlap one another, and that's okay. It actually helps us to create an environment that is a little bit more interesting, and you can actually mix and match all of these just by kind of moving them around and causing them to overlap. So we do something like this. Feels pretty good. And then I'm going to duplicate this by hitting Control D. I'm going to move this out and maybe rotate it a little bit, and perhaps even drop it down on the Y a little bit to make it look like it's a different piece. Okay, so we've got something like that. Feels pretty good. And I'm going to hit Control D on this one. One thing that you'll want to show off to your participants, that while using assets like this, is that if you use an asset that has special things like this little hole cut out of it, you'll notice that the player might notice that too and go, oh, well, it's just the same asset over and over again. So if you do a good job of mixing these things together, like so, then you can actually hide that, and it won't be that big of a deal. You could also use some of these smaller assets, like these cliff edges. And oops, let's not use cliff big. Let's use maybe the cliff edge. And you can make an adjustment here and make it look a little bit different. Okay, so now it's not just that open hole like so. Okay. Let's use something like this rock chunk. This might be a good one to use. Create something like that. Control D. Okay. And notice how stacking those and changing them really makes a difference. Okay, and you can have a lot of fun with this. Give your participants an opportunity to really have some fun in this and building out their environments the way that they see fit. All right, so that looks good. Pretty happy with that. A couple of things that you'll want to watch out for with the participants and show them is that you don't want to create any areas that they could possibly jump up onto and get up on this and then outside of the level. So just be mindful of that. So now that we have that blocked out, we can go ahead and select our parameter or perimeter that we created using ProBuilder and delete it out. Now, something that's going to be key here is you'll also want to make sure that you don't have any holes. So make sure that the terrain is there in place. It's not creating any issues. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. Okay, and that looks great. All right, so now that we've built this out, there's a couple of other things that you could have your participants do. I would go through the process of maybe adding some rocks inside of the center because we want to break up the flatness of all of this. We know that there's going to be some sort of acid pool here that we're going to build in. So I'm going to do something like this rock ledge. And it kind of looks like this, this piece here that would be actually pretty cool to see. Let's go ahead and scale this down. And I'm going to scale it down to something like that, to where the player could actually jump onto it and use it as kind of like a springboard or something like that, to where they could actually jump over that acid pit. But if they're not careful, they could actually fall off into the acid pit. And it's also a way to just kind of break up the overall level itself. So that way it's not, flat and bare. And it also creates some sort of like focal point for the player to see. Okay. After that, at this point, just allow your participants to play a little bit, to allow them to move around and create something that's fun and something that they would be interested in. So then, after you have all of this set up, it would be a good idea to go into prefabs and talking about how prefabs are going to be helpful. So what we would do is, in our case, we have all of these assets here. And what we want to do is we want to add some colliders to all of this. So if we take a look at our Cliff Big here and we go to Inspector, the player would actually be able to walk through these, and we don't want that to happen. So what we would do is, at this point, what we would do is go ahead and add a component to this. The collider that we would want to use on this is going to be a mesh collider. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a mesh collider, and then I'm going to set the mesh that is going to be used to the Cliff Big 03. So I'm going to actually type that in. I'm going to type in Cliff and Big 03. But you'll notice that there are a couple of different ones. There's LOD00, LOD01, LOD02, and we want to use LOD02 because it has the least amount of vertices in that. Okay, so we'll use that. And you'll notice here that we've added this cliff here. But the problem that we're having here is that, let's see, Cliff Big. Oh, I accidentally duplicated the wrong piece there. So a couple of things that you'll want to watch out for is that whenever you're duplicating these pieces, that you're selecting the topmost object and not the LOD. So I made a mistake there. Looking at this, I could see that I have LOD0, LOD1, but then there's these extras here that got brought in by accident. So I need to replace those. So in this case, I'm going to select Cliff Big 03, Control D. And let's reposition that. Okay, and let's do something like this. Let's maybe not add so many in there. Okay, so now that we have that there, I think we have one more that we may have done that to by accident. Okay, we're good. All right, so now on these, like this one here, we have this mesh collider. And what we want to do is perhaps maybe make that into a prefab. And this can be done very easily. You'll want to show your participants how to make these into prefabs. My suggestion would be to make a brand new prefabs folder. There is a prefabs folder inside of the 3D Game Kit assets, but we don't want to create our own prefabs doing that. So if we look at like the level prefabs, you can see that there are several here. Even in the environment, if we go to rock, you can see that there's this Cliff Big with all of these different mesh colliders on it. And I don't want to overwrite these, okay? So what we'll do is inside of our folder, you'll notice there's this workshop folder, or workshop files folder. Inside of that prefabs, you can show how to create a new folder and call this environment. And then inside of that, what we're going to do is we're going to take Cliff Big 03 that has the mesh collider and everything on it. And we're going to left click and drag that into here. And we'll do the same thing for Cliff Big 01. We want to make sure that the mesh collider component is there. And we're using the lowest LOD for that mesh collider. And let's take Cliff Big 01, drop that in here. And Cliff Big 02, again, same thing. And this is an opportunity to allow your participants to get the hang of doing this. So allow them to create their prefabs and updating these. Now, because we have set these as prefabs, you'll notice that this one is Cliff Big 02, but it has not updated. It hasn't added that that mesh collider in there. And that's the reason for that is because we added these before they were actually created as a prefab. So what we'll do is we'll actually replace this and we'll reposition that. Okay. And then we also have our rock chunks. So on the rock chunk, let's go ahead and add our mesh collider. And we're going to type in its name again. We're going to use the lowest LOD for that. And I also want to make sure that the name is not Rock Chunk 01 or well, actually, yeah, we do on this one. Drag and drop that into the prefabs there. Now, one other thing that you could do is you could also show how to copy components. So I can actually copy this mesh collider component by right-clicking on the label, copy component, and then go to the other rock chunk. Right-click on the LOD group label or the transform label and say paste component as new. And there we go. Now, there's no reason to apply that prefab to that. Okay, it should be fine. All right, so now everything has been set up. The last thing is to create the mesh collider for this one because the player will definitely come in contact with that. So in this one, it's going to be, I believe it was like a ledge. So rock ledge 02 LOD2. Here we go. And let's go ahead and create a prefab for that. All right, so I think we are all done. Now, Once we've done all of that work, we're talking about prefabs. Make sure that you talk about the concept of prefabs and why they're important inside of Unity. So now that we've done that, we've created our prefabs. Now what we want to do is give the participants the opportunity to add in other assets, to do some set dressing. This will give you some time to walk around the room and kind of see where people are and things like that. So give your participants some direction. So they'll want to go to the 3D Game Kit folder, and they can go to the prefabs folder, environment, and they could work with things like vegetation, and they could look through the different vegetation pieces. They could drag and drop those in. Okay, these are already going to have some things already set up. So like the mesh colliders and all that, remind them that they can scale things around or scale them. They can move things around. And just give the participants time to play, okay, and really get used to doing some set dressing like this. So vegetation is not the only thing that they can use. They can look at all of the environment pieces and really start to experiment with all of this. So the final thing that should be done to kind of finish off this part is they'll need to add in the acid to this. And I think the acid, yeah, it's under interactables. And they can actually drag and drop that right into the scene there. So to create kind of this acid pool. Now this acid pool is really neat. You'll want to position this over the that hole there. Okay, and do something like that. Now, I don't really like the edges of this. I feel like there should be something a little bit more there. So instruct your participants to maybe add a little bit more rock work around this. So you could use the prefabs from this one, or you could use the models. It's totally up to you. But I would suggest using something like the Cliff Edge. I believe it's going to be Cliff Edge 03. And it's kind of this round shape here. But you'll scale this down and put it into position to where it looks something kind of like this. Okay, rotate it around so that way it looks like it's going into the ground. So it's overlapping with the mud. Okay, and this gives you a nice, neat little border that can go around the acid pool. My suggestion would also be to set this to where it is local once you have the overall orientation ready. Okay, maybe kind of adjust that a little bit. And then Control D, we'll move this around. And just create as many that is necessary to kind of cover up that ugly hole there. Okay, so that looks pretty good there. If you have a little bit of a separation in between that, that's all right. I'm going to deselect that just so I can see what it looks like here. It feels pretty good. And there we go. So now we've got this neat little pit here. We could probably move this back a little bit. So that way it kind of looks like the end of that is right over that pool. Okay, and there we go. Again, just give your participants enough time to kind of play around with this. This is going to be a great time for them to kind of explore and create. Remind your participants to save their scenes. And so in this case, what I would do is go ahead and save this as, let's say, something like main or something like that. So I would put this in the workshop files folder under scenes, and we call this main. Save that out. And there we go. So when we come back, I'll have my scene kind of set up, and you can get an example of what that looks like with some different vegetation pieces. But really at this point, this is really all you would need to teach the class. If you want to have your own scene to where you've got it all set, dressed in the way that you like it, you can go ahead and do that. It's not a big deal. So whenever you're teaching it, just be prepared with different scenes if you want to show progression on how things are set up in your level. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and move on.